Hi, and welcome back. Thanks for joining me in our 14th episode in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. In the last episode, we began the final third of Jesus' sermon in Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 begins by Jesus issuing a strong warning against passing judgment without mercy. As we're going through the 7th chapter, we're headed to the point in verse 12 where Jesus tells us how we're supposed to treat others the way in which we would want to be treated, and giving us what we consider to be the golden rule. In between those two important sayings, in between those sayings of justice and love, there's a very strange and puzzling teaching that Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 6. So let's go ahead and read the text. Jesus says, "Do not give that which is holy to the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you." And that is a strange saying, to be sure. What is Jesus getting at? What is the point he's trying to make? How does it fit into the framework of justice and love of the 7th chapter? Well, Jesus here, he is acknowledging what is a difficult and harsh reality. That difficult and harsh reality is not everyone is going to accept and embrace the gospel. Yes, the gospel is for everyone, and God and Jesus desire everyone to be saved, but not everyone is going to respond to the gospel with love and contrition and obedience. And that can be difficult. That can be difficult when it is encountered. Jesus here seems to be giving us wisdom as we go about our kingdom work, as we try to advance the cause of the kingdom in the hearts and minds of other people, that we're going to encounter some people who not just are going to reject it, but who might even be hostile toward it and toward us as messengers of this good news. However, this statement sometimes has been misunderstood and misapplied. Jesus here is not condoning prejudice of any kind. Have you ever been prejudiced in your thinking and your approach of the kingdom? Or maybe that might be difficult for us to admit, but maybe we have in the past. Have you ever looked at someone and thought, oh, there's a person who'd never want the gospel, and just ignored them and moved on? If you've ever thought like that, perhaps you need to reevaluate your approach toward the gospel. The Bible, throughout its message, condemns prejudice, and this comes across in a variety of ways. For example, number one, if you look at Exodus chapter 19 and verses 33 and 34, the passage says, "When a stranger sojourns in your land, you should not do him wrong. Treat him as a native. Love him as you love yourself, for you were strangers once in the land of Egypt." Now, while that passage comes out of the Old Testament and was said by God to Moses as Israel is forming their nation, you could have just as easily found that passage in the Sermon on the Mount. It has shades and echoes of the Golden Rule all through it. Jesus here, though, God is talking about how Israel was to treat foreigners and immigrants and people who had come to their land from other places. How were they to look at them? How were they to treat them and embrace them? They were to treat them as themselves. Why? Well, because once they were the stranger. Once they were the foreigner. Another example of the Bible condemning prejudice, showing God and showing Jesus' attitude toward it, can be found in how Jesus interacted and treated the Samaritans. Certainly there is quite an ethnic divide between the Jews and the Samaritans. There is ethnic hatred generationally between these two groups. And all of that comes out in the interactions that Jesus and his disciples have with the Samaritans. However, we have an example in John chapter 4 where Jesus goes to the well of Jacob in a city in Samaria, and he strikes up a conversation. He initiates the conversation with a woman who was a Samaritan, and he speaks to her in very kind and loving ways. He takes an interest in her. He talks about eternal life with her. And she is very excited about the prospect of perhaps having discovered the Messiah. And she goes into the town and she tells all of the men of the town. And then they have time and opportunity to meet Jesus and to listen to him teach. And at the end of all of this interaction between Jesus, who was a Jew, and the Samaritans, in spite of all of the ethnic hatred, they embraced Jesus. It's quite a surprising reaction. Another example of Jesus dealing with the Samaritans and the disciples dealing with the Samaritans is in Luke chapter 9. And we've referenced this encounter in previous episodes. However, the ethnic hatred is on display. The disciples go into Samaria to try to make preparations to spend the night there. And they come back to Jesus with very bad news that the Samaritans basically told them that they were not wanted. They were not welcomed in the town. And James and John, who are very angry at this, asked Jesus if they should call a fire to fall down from heaven and to kill and destroy and wipe out the Samaritans. Jesus rebukes James and John for their hatred, for their prejudice, and says they don't know what spirit is in them. And Jesus says that he has come not to destroy men's lives, but to save men's lives. Jesus was coming to save even the Samaritans. In time, of course, James and John would learn this and would even go to Samaria themselves in teaching the gospel. Lastly, a last example of how the Bible shows how God condemns prejudice is found in the fact that the gospel was taken to non-Jews. That certainly can be seen in Jesus' treatment of the Samaritans, but the gospel is taken to the Gentiles. In Acts chapter 10, when all of this begins to unfold, by God's providence, he brings together Gentiles and Peter. He brings together the house of Cornelius and Peter. The gospel is preached there. And Peter makes this acknowledgement how God is not a God of partiality, but rather those who fear him and do what is right, he accepts. So it's not a matter of one's ethnic background or one's race. Becoming a child of God is all about one's attitude, one's heart toward God and toward the gospel. The house of Cornelius, they obey the gospel. They're baptized and welcomed into God's family. Later on, though, Peter has some very difficult issues with this. He acts very hypocritically. He acts out of prejudice in his dealings with the Jews and his dealings with the Gentiles. And it's an encounter that is well documented in Galatians chapter 2. When Paul sees what has happened, how Peter is being very prejudicial and hypocritical in his treatment, Paul calls Peter out and rebukes him for it. So this was an issue that Peter struggled with. But when it reared its ugly head, Paul spoke up and took a stand for what is right and took a stand for the truth. So this statement here in Matthew chapter 7 is not about being prejudicial in our treatment of others. So what is this teaching really about? Well, Jesus is encouraging us, as he often did, to be wise as serpents in preparing ourselves when we encounter some who would reject and even be hostile toward the gospel. Jesus is trying to protect us as we advance the cause of the kingdom. He says here that, as he does in other places in Matthew chapter 10, where there's similar warnings that are given, Jesus knows that some are not just going to indifferently reject the gospel, but that some are going to ridicule the messenger. Some might even try to do the messenger harm. And so Jesus is trying to prepare us for that and to give us instruction as to what we're to do when we encounter it. So how should we react when we find and encounter pigs and dogs who are vicious and hostile toward the gospel? Well, we're not to engage them. We're not to endlessly engage them with arguing and going round and round with them. In Proverbs chapter 9, in verses 7 and 8, Solomon says, "Whoever corrects a scoffer gets abused. He who reproves a wicked man gets injured. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you." So there's judgment that needs to be used in how we engage and encounter people. Paul and Barnabas are an example of how they moved on. They came to Antioch of Pisidia in Acts chapter 13, and they preached the gospel in a synagogue there. They stayed for an entire week teaching and discussing the gospel. At the end of that time, though, there are some who became very violent toward them. And so they left. They shook the dust off their feet, as the expression is used, and they moved on to those who would receive the gospel. So in conclusion, this is a strange saying, to be sure, and if we're not careful, we will misuse it and misapply it. We'll use it to justify prejudice, which is not in keeping with what the Bible has to say about that very sinful and divisive action. Rather, we're to use wisdom in our dealings as we go about trying to advance the kingdom. Wisdom is demonstrated in the discerning use of the gospel, our time, and ability. The reality that some will be hostile toward the gospel may be difficult for us to accept. However, we're not to waste the precious gifts that God has given us on those who have no aspirations for holiness. And sadly, there are some who are so mired in sin, whose hearts have become so hardened that they have no aspirations for holiness. Instead, we need to be trying to advance the kingdom in the lives of those who are like the ones Jesus described at the beginning of this sermon. Those that we find who are poor in spirit, those who are meek and brokenhearted, those who are ready and willing to give their hearts to God and come to the kingdom. I thank you for listening today. I hope the lesson has been helpful in bringing some clarity to this strange and puzzling statement, that we can make better use of our efforts to advance the kingdom in the hearts and minds of other people. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.